Honored guests, ladies and gentlemen, fellows and students of Tembusu and our sibling colleges, welcome to the 28th Tembusu Forum. As you know, the chairmanship of ASEAN revolves among its member states. This year it's occupied by Singapore, and we invited the ambassadors of the ASEAN nations to our inaugural dinner to mark that occasion. Tonight is our second ASEAN event of the semester, and we go from a purely celebratory mode to a reflective one, raising one of the greatest challenges for this region, which is dealing in a united way with the so-called great powers. Throughout my own childhood in the 1960s and early 1970s, violent images of Southeast Asia were beamed into televisions around the world every single day, mostly from Vietnam, but also Cambodia, Laos, sometimes even Thailand and the Philippines, where America had bases. This region was then convulsed by great power, conflict, and rivalry, as it had been ever since the arrival of Portuguese and Spanish colonizers in the 16th century. It's ASEAN's remarkable achievement to have kept peace in the region and the great powers at arm's length for almost 5 decades now. And during this half-century, no one's worked more tirelessly at that project than our rector, Professor Tommy Koh, in his ambassadorial role. Professor Koh has written and spoken forcefully all year on why ASEAN should remain united, independent, and neutral, and why Singaporeans should care about that. And tonight, he's assembled a distinguished panel to help him lay out the challenges to a new generation, yourselves. So let's welcome to the podium the founder and convener of the Tembusu Forum, Professor Tommy Koh.
Thank you very much, Greg. The master of the college was exaggerating about my role in ASEAN. It's a very minute role, though. But thank you very much for the compliment. This is the 28th Tembusu Forum that I have organized and chaired. So I'm very happy that there's so many students here this evening. I was a little worried whether the topic would put some of you off, but it's an important topic and it's a serious topic. I want to begin by greeting some of our distinguished guests, beginning with Sharon Xia. Sharon, can you just stand up? Sharon, let's give her. Sharon is the Associate Director of the Center for International Law at NUS. She was also one of my 2 co-editors in the book that we published last year on the occasion of ASEAN 50th anniversary, the title of which is 50 Years of ASEAN in Singapore. So Sharon, thank you for joining us. I'd like next to introduce Professor Kong Yun Fong. Prof. Kong is one of these super bright Malaysians, and we thank Malaysia for the gift of Kong Yun Fong to Singapore. He had taught at Oxford University, is a brilliant political scientist, very knowledgeable about great power relation. Prof. Kong is currently teaching at the Lee Kuan Yew School, and he, together with the next person I'm going to introduce, Professor Kanti Bajpai. Kanti, can you stand up? Kanti Bajpai. They have launched an excellent program, a master's degree in international affairs. So for Tembusu students who are thinking of going on to a graduate degree, and if your interest area is international affairs, do consider doing it at the Lee Kuan Yew School. I want to also introduce somebody who honored us with his presence at our formal dinner, my good friend and colleague, Gerard Ho. Gerard, please. Gerard is the Director General in charge of ASEAN at MFA. And as you can imagine, this has been a very busy year for him. And Gerard has done a super job. Gerard, thank you for coming. Lastly, I want to introduce a young friend, Clarence Teo. Clarence, can you stand up, please? Clarence Teo. I wanted Clarence to join us this evening because I want the student to know about the organization he works for. He works for the Singapore International Foundation, which I have sometimes referred to as Singapore's friendly face to the world. I used to say that MFA, but SIF is an even more friendly face. Their job is to make friends of Singapore. Their job is to bring Singapore volunteers to help in our neighboring countries. Their job is to use our specialist volunteers to upgrade medical school, hospital, nursing institutions, and so on. They do very good work, and I wanted Clarence to be with us. Now, Greg has already referred to one of the three reasons why I convened this forum. First reason is we are the chairman of ASEAN this year. The second reason is that I worry very much about ASEAN's future. I worry because I see two pressures on us, and I hope that ASEAN can withstand this pressure, can maintain our unity, our independence, and neutrality. And what are these two pressures? One is a growing confrontation between the two most important and most powerful countries of the world, the United States and China. For the student here who would like to know more, I ask you to read two things. A speech made on the 4th of October by the United States Vice President Mike Pence to the Hudson Institute in Washington. This is the most serious and coherent policy speech that the Trump administration had made on China. And it's a fierce speech. It is a fighting speech. I have never heard an American leader describe another country in the terms that Pence had described China since the end of the Cold War. And I worry, because if we are beginning to see the beginning of a new Cold War between the United States and China, this is not good news for ASEAN, because we will come under tremendous pressure from these two great powers, the SIC side. And they will also do things to isolate each other, which will impact us. For example, I draw your attention to the recently concluded US-Mexico-Canada agreement. In this new USMCA, there is a provision that in effect forbids Mexico and Canada from concluding trade agreements with a non-market economy, which is a code word for China. Yeah. So this raises an alarm bell in my head, The other things I've asked you to read, if you want to know even more, is a report that was published in 2015 by the Council on Foreign Relations. It's authored by a very good friend of mine, Ambassador Robert Black-Will, and another colleague. It is the report of a bipartisan group of Americans from both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. It's called A New Grand Strategy on China. And it's not good news, because what it says essentially is that the era during which America sought to bring China out of isolation and into international society, the era when America tried to persuade China to be a responsible stakeholder is over. And now we enter a new era of strategic competition. So that's one pressure that worries me. The other pressure that worries me even more is that ASEAN has thrived and prospered because in the last 51 years, we lived under a liberal multilateral order, an order that promotes free trade, open economies, economic integration. And you now have, in the capital of the most important country of the world, a leader that's against all those things, against free trade, against open economies, against regional economic integration. And I think this is bad news for ASEAN. So these are the reasons why I've decided to convene this evening's forum on ASEAN and the great powers. And I persuaded four of my good friends to speak with us, beginning with Professor Simon Tay. Professor Simon Tay is one of Singapore's rare Renaissance men. He's a professor at the law school, chairman of the much respected Singapore Institute of International Affairs. He's also an award-winning poet and novelist. And most importantly, Simon, he's the father of Luke, who's a member of this college. So Simon, you have 15 minutes.
Well, thank you, Prof. Ko, for those very generous introductory remarks, but also laying the stage so clearly for all the speakers. I do agree with Prof. Ko, but let me take the global context first, and then secondly, talk about an individual opportunity or challenge for your generation and still those of us who are still around. I think first on the global, I agree with Prof that really one of the challenges facing us is the US-China conflict. And let us examine the nature of this conflict very briefly. It is not a trade war. Trade is the instrument that's being used as the first provocation of this war. It is actually a deeply economic and a war almost by any means other than actual warfare. It is truly a competition across many fronts. The second thing, which Prof. Ko also hinted at, is it is not merely a matter of Donald Trump. The orange hair brings a particular attention to his actions. But actually, as he mentioned the CFR report, by the end of the Obama administration, people had given up this idea of engaging China in a positive way. They had shifted, and many of the more aggressive, hawkish views in America were clearly for this position, no matter who won. In fact, if you recall, China was more concerned if Clinton had won. She probably would have pursued it much more smartly. So this phenomena is unlikely to disappear, no matter what happens in the midterms, whether Donald Trump stays or goes on Russia, on other issues. So it is probably a longer-term phenomena. I don't know exactly how long, but it could be perhaps 10 years. And there is a risk for many of us to be negatively impacted as of like almost innocent bystanders being whacked in a gunfight between an OK Corral. But let me turn to some of the positives. ASEAN, which we are our topic today, stands actually to gain. Even before China's problems over trade with America, people have been looking for what they call a China +1 strategy. China's costs had risen. China's shortage of manpower, China's deep question over resources, and question mark over pollution. These were some factors that made people want to move some production base out of China. Plus, for the Japanese and the Koreans, various actions by China against the Chinese investments over various incidences, and with Korea over the deployment of THAAD, what the Americans gave them. Both of these have reminded their near neighbors and key investors that China will exact a political price if they were to move out of line. So for these reasons, people are looking for this other place to invest in beside China. ASEAN, our region, has its own attractions. Our region, no, not without problems, as we can discuss later, is outgrowing global performance rates. Almost all the countries are doing well. There are political uncertainties, there are injustices, as I said, we're not perfect. But by and large, the growth patterns have been there in each country. More than that, the ASEAN economic community, again, far from perfect, has integrated the countries economically much more clearly than before. We are not a union, but certainly the arrow, the direction sign, is towards closer integration, economically, but also in the movement of peoples. And we feel this very strongly here in Singapore. Singapore has been a hub. And here, let me move on to my third point, which is the opportunities facing Singapore and Singaporeans, especially of your generation. Really, the generation looking forward, if we are halfway right about this US-China competition and this ASEAN +1 strategy, will see ASEAN do even better than we're doing today. The opportunities, if you look at Indonesia, in the space you probably love most, the new technologies, the amount of energy, the amount of capital chasing ideas, the amount of starting fledgling entrepreneurship, these are going to reshape Indonesia's economy far beyond what we've seen so far. And Indonesia's already done fairly well. Yeah. This leap forward by Indonesia can be a place where Singapore can participate on a win-win basis and gain from if we seize the opportunity. Just as the previous generation plowed the fields in China, and the present generation is plowing the fields in a difficult territory called India, I think the next challenge will be finding ways to work with Indonesia much more deeply. And some of the spade work has already been done. The recent bilateral summit between our leaders and President Jokowi has quite a step forward. More can be done. Similarly, if you look further north, the countries of Northeast Asia, of the northern part of ASEAN, Thailand and up Indochina, really are contiguous physically. They can also draw not just from the Indo-China trade, India and China, but from Thailand. Thailand has done pretty well, but its costs are getting high. It needs to reach out. It's in a bit of a status at the moment because of the military government and, frankly, 10 years of infighting over the domestic issues. But if these come a little bit clearer in the next 5 years, we could see Thailand also take a leap up. And these two are the largest economies of our region. Singapore is well poised to gain from this, as well as from China and India's growth. But we must be ready for it. I don't mean government to be. Government is doing its part. But many of our companies are still struggling. And more than that, even when those who try find that many Singaporeans are unwilling to travel in the region and not knowledgeable and open in perspectives about the region. We are much more likely to get on a plane to New York or London than we are if I say to you, go to Jakarta or Phnom Penh. Bangkok, you might go for shopping and food, but maybe not for work. So let me close here. I think that the challenge coming up is whether ASEAN as a whole, and Singapore in particular, can exercise what I call the power of and, using an epsilon. In my book, which I published in 2010, I talked about America that was relatively isolationist, that only wanted to deal with the world on its own terms, and blamed Asia for succeeding where it had struggled. This is before Trump was even considered to be a contender. I talked about China that was too aggressive and too assertive for its own good, sparking anti-Chinese problems, which have happened now across Asia, let alone in Washington, D.C. ASEAN needs the weight and judgment, the wisdom to remain united, as Prof. Koh and others have called for, and to find ways to work with all sides equally. In this, we see the approach of first very practical stuff, the Belt and Road Initiative, or other infrastructure should be made into smart, sustainable infrastructure, things we have never seen before in our region, but we need desperately to connect. Secondly, and here it comes back to the Faculty of Law where I teach, we need to be a society of norms. We need, as a group, to uphold certain norms of peace, progress, and democracy. Thank you.
I thank Simon for your contribution. Our next speaker is my favorite Myanmar friend in Singapore, Thuzar. I first knew her when she was a diplomat in the Myanmar Foreign Service. I think we met at the Earth Summit in '92. Her father was the then Minister for the Environment. She subsequently worked in the ASEAN Secretariat and did very well and gained a good reputation. I'm glad she married a Singaporean, and she relocated from Jakarta to Singapore. She's been working at the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies, the Yusof Ishak Institute, as a researcher in the ASEAN Studies department. I've invited Mo to speak to us this evening from two perspectives. From the perspective of a citizen of Myanmar, and also from the perspective of a researcher in a think tank. Mo, please.
A very good evening to everyone gathered here for the 28th Tembusu Forum, and a big thank you to the Tembusu College for having me back here again. My biggest thanks, of course, is to its rector, Prof. Tommy, especially for the loveliest introduction I've had in ages before I've taken the podium, so to speak. So when thinking about what I can say in the 15 minutes, now 14 minutes and 33 seconds remaining, there's a lot I want to say. And because Prof. Tommy had asked me to speak from two perspectives, one as the perspective of a citizen of Myanmar, and the other as a researcher who has been following regional governance issues in ASEAN, particularly related to what we call the people issues, things that arise in the socio-cultural community, but which nevertheless have the potential to affect what goes on for economic growth as well as for political stability. So I thought I might focus on something that, well, the moment you hear my nationality and my citizenship, you'll probably think of what's happening with that country in ASEAN. So I'd like to juxtapose what's happening in one ASEAN member country with the way that ASEAN has dealt with it, because that will affect on how ASEAN engages with or deals with the great power in the name of upholding ASEAN centrality. So I've got three main points that I'd like to make, and I'm following, again, Prof. Tommy's excellent example here by trying to get the message across in three main points. And they all start with C. So the first point, or broad heading, is really about crisis and change. And the speakers before me, Prof. Tommy in introducing the context of the forum, and Simon in outlining both the opportunities and the challenges that this region stands at the cusp of. Indeed, it is really a juxtaposition of crisis and change. It would not be an exaggeration to say that there is currently what we would say an inflection point for centrality because of the Rohingya issue in Myanmar, that ASEAN has had to try to exert its quiet diplomacy. So Myanmar itself is going through, again, another spiral, as it has through the different spirals of history since the early modern periods. There have been recurring arcs of communities in crisis in Myanmar. And it won't be an exaggeration to say that Myanmar is yet again going through the experience of communities in crisis. It is not a community in crisis, it is communities in crisis. And therefore, questions of where is the center, who is in the driving seat, become very relevant. In the Myanmar context, we are all asking, who is assuming responsibility, who is engaging the international community, and who is trying to construct a constructive narrative. So the question of where is the center in Myanmar, is it Naypyidaw? If it is Naypyidaw, is it the State Councillor's office or is it the Commander-in-Chief's office? Where is the center and who is in the driving seat become relevant at the national level of a member country like Myanmar, but also impinges on questions similar at the ASEAN level as to how is ASEAN centrality being affected by this time of crisis and change going on. In fact, what we are seeing in Myanmar really is sort of coming full circle from about 20 years ago when Myanmar first became an ASEAN member state in 1997. Then, as now, the Rohingya issue was a question raised at the time of Myanmar's membership. But also, international focus at that time was on the democracy movement in Myanmar and the related challenges, Aung San Suu Kyi under house arrest, the forced labor issue, and the broader ethnic concerns among the different ethnic armed insurgencies that were taking place, and how the military junta of the time was dealing with all of this. And so it is not that ASEAN, when discussing membership issues with Myanmar, did not bring this up. They did. And it is not that ASEAN's interlocutors, the great powers, did not raise this with ASEAN and pointed out how ASEAN's credibility would be affected if the association were to engage with a country under a repressive military dictatorship and a country that had proved recalcitrant. But ASEAN took the stand, and it was a unified stand, that if you don't engage, then sending a state into a pariah type of situation and letting it slip further into a failed state situation is something that ASEAN does not want, because it is all about stability. And so if we think about that and look at the situation now 20 years ago, it is slightly different, but yet there are parallels. ASEAN does not want Myanmar to fail. ASEAN wants to help Myanmar, but it is finding that difficulty of where do we look at community and centrality, challenges that beset both ASEAN and Myanmar. So that was my second set of C's. And it comes to then how ASEAN makes its decisions and projects its position with its interlocutors. And this is consultation and consensus. ASEAN has tried to employ this through all the crises that it has faced. Myanmar was in 1997, but of course, there was also the East Timor issue with Indonesia. ASEAN tried to deal with that through the consultation and consensus manner and trying to find constructive pathways. And Myanmar all throughout has been comfortable with this modus operandi, modus vivendi. In fact, all the ASEAN member states use this to perhaps, if I have to be a bit cynical, to their national advantage, especially the non-interference principle. But that is also the principle with which ASEAN's interlocutors, dialogue partners, the great powers, will like to highlight and point out in terms of ASEAN being less than effective in finding constructive solutions. And yet, in a way, we can also say that ASEAN has been able to bend that constructive engagement, the principle of non-interference via constructive engagement with Myanmar. So we can't really say that we can't interfere in Myanmar. In fact, if we look back 10 years ago to when Cyclone Nargis happened, and ASEAN point blank asked Myanmar, right here in Singapore on Vesak Day, if I remember correctly, Prof. Tommy, when ASEAN foreign ministers point blank asked their Myanmar counterpart, what does ASEAN mean to you? And what will you do to show that ASEAN membership means something to you? I'm paraphrasing, of course, but that was a very hard question, to which the Myanmar military regime at the time capitulated, I would say, and went along. So there are ways of constructively interfering in a country, and I think this is with what is happening in Myanmar today, ASEAN is trying to do in finding that constructive narrative, not letting a hardline, ultra-nationalist, militaristic type of narrative capture the story, the trajectory of Myanmar's opening up and democratization that ASEAN has been trying to encourage. So in the time remaining to me, I'd like to look at coming full circle from all of this to see how, in the time of crisis, via the platform of ASEAN, we can try to see how some kind of constructive change can be effected. And because of my past experiences, my past lived experience, I am a believer in the ASEAN mechanism. And there are very interesting venues that we do. But I think when we think about ASEAN, when we talk about ASEAN, the thing that comes to mind is 9 countries going in together or doing something together for the member country in question. I would like to posit that it is also time perhaps to think about innovative ways. After all, this year's theme that has been set for Singapore's ASEAN Year is resilience and innovation. So now more than ever, in building resilience to the kind of crisis in confidence, crisis in credibility that ASEAN will have to face, the innovative way of dealing with that would be to see how, still under the ASEAN framework, countries individually, member states that are ASEAN individually, can do something constructive at a bilateral or a sub-regional manner with the country in question that needs the assistance. We see this happening to a certain extent in Myanmar today. Indonesia has tried to exercise quiet diplomacy and in actually succeeding in getting Aung San Suu Kyi to talk about this in the ASEAN level, and that is a first. All through the years of ASEAN trying to bring up the Rohingya issue in Myanmar, under the military government, there was always a denial that this is an issue internal to Myanmar and this is not something for ASEAN to discuss. So let's not discount that ASEAN efforts managed to get Myanmar to host a special meeting of the foreign ministers to talk about this, and that's the first time it has become an ASEAN topic. And once it becomes an ASEAN topic, it stays on the agenda, so we do have that entry point. But again, here, this is where bilateral initiatives done by ASEAN members under the ASEAN framework might have some bearing. Indonesia has school and hospital projects in Rakhine State, and the focus there, I think, is very timely. We are now looking at future generations of young people in Rakhine State, whether they are Rakhine ethnicities or whether they are from the Rohingya community. Young people who will probably grow up without knowing what is it to belong, what is it that they can contribute, and what are the benefits of being a citizen. So when you talk about ethnicity, citizenship, and identity, these are very important issues that ASEAN probably can help to deal with at levels that we have not seen. We've seen regional level activities where countries come together, and that's important, that's useful. All of you may also have heard about youth exchange activities, student exchange activities, where you actually learn and interact with your peers from other countries. But using that and having that knowledge of what you know about the region, and having that spark of wanting to help others in need, which is very strong in young people, I'd like to explore the theme of volunteerism as one of the constructive channels through which the next generation of ASEAN can start building stronger foundations for the future. And I am aware of what the Singapore International Foundation has been doing. It's been doing excellent community-level projects that have actually, I think, highlighted the role that an ASEAN member such as Singapore can play in bringing up the level of interaction and development and knowledge transfer that happens in this region. Intergovernmentally, of course, we have initiatives that are called the Initiative for ASEAN Integration, which looks at building capacities for the government officials, because politicians may come and go, political governments have a cycle, but the people who have to ensure policy implementation are the bureaucrats. So ASEAN is looking at that, and that's one level. But again, going back to the spirit of volunteerism, this is something that I've been researching ever since 2008, when young people at the time wrote to the ASEAN Secretary General, the now late Dr. Surin Pitsuwan, asking to go to the disaster-struck villages devastated by Cyclone Nargis in Myanmar to help rebuild the villagers' lives. And the ASEAN Humanitarian Task Force, which was operating out of Yangon at the time, facilitated these young people's stay and travel to the Delta region. And from then on, the region-wide initiatives were born. We now have the ASEAN Youth Volunteers Program, which has its permanent secretariat at University Kebangsaan Malaysia. We also have different volunteerism programs that are facilitated and negotiated through bilateral channels. But let's not forget, the bilateral channels are those that have been forged and facilitated through the virtue of being the part of the network, of the family of nations that make up ASEAN. And therefore, I think, to sum up, coming full circle, we are again looking at how to find the opportunities for change constructively in a time that we seem to be at this inflection point for centrality. And with a note to Myanmar, what the young people can do, of course, needs to be facilitated via the governments, because in ASEAN there is this lovely escape clause that the country in question needs to have asked for it before we can offer our assistance. But that is where the ASEAN quiet diplomacy efforts come in. And I think my fervent hope is through all these constructive interactions, I'd like to see Myanmar return to the kind of ASEAN first policy that it seemed to have only a few years ago, rather than to a more neutral, isolationist type of attitude because of the tremendous international pressure that it is facing. And the relevance to ASEAN and the great powers. ASEAN centrality is premised on ASEAN countries having that credibility of a unified position through, I think, what Simon has mentioned, the diffusion of norms for peace, progress, and democracy. Now, if we lose that credibility, if only one member state says, I have a choice, if you don't want to help me, I can go and negotiate with my big neighbors, my large partners who are ready to build infrastructure and throw money at me, then that, I think, is the challenge that we face, that we'll need to look at how to recapture that constructive narrative. I apologize for ending on a little bit of a dire and doom and gloom note, but I think it's important to highlight how, yes, there is difficulties, there are challenges, but in the time of challenge, I think there is a time-honored adage that says we can find opportunities. So the optimist in me would like to see those opportunities. Thank you.
I thank Mo for speaking to us from her heart. She's one Myanmar colleague who does not hesitate to use the R word. She's willing to refer to the refugees, which many Myanmar leaders are not willing to call by the name by which they call themselves, Rohingyas. So thank you, Mo. And I'd also like to say that, that I would commend those of you who want to know more about the impact of Cyclone Nargis and how ASEAN responded to that crisis, to read her book. She's written a very good book about the Cyclone Nargis and how in that humanitarian crisis, ASEAN was able to persuade a very reluctant military government to enter into a tripartite arrangement consisting of Myanmar, ASEAN, and UN. And through this tripartite framework, to bring international aid to the country and to help Myanmar in the recovery and reconstruction. Yeah. I think if I'm not wrong, Mo, thank you for referring to the more recent events in the Rakhine State and your point that ASEAN is only as strong as its weakest member, and the humanitarian crisis in the Rakhine State poses a challenge to our credibility and our quest for centrality. You know, I just want to refer briefly to a very important statement that Foreign Minister Vivian Balakrishnan made at the UN last month, in which I think he made 3 points. One, that the members of the armed forces that committed atrocities, killing, rape, and so on, against unarmed civilians must be held accountable. And second, that ASEAN countries should do what we can to help the nearly 1 million refugees that have taken shelter across the border in the Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh. And third, his appeal to all the stakeholders in Myanmar that for the long term, the only solution is a political solution. Yeah. So, the third speaker is an old friend and colleague, Adrian. Adrian Tan was a colleague at MFA for 20 years, but he decided to leave the Foreign Service and to reincarnate himself as a think tanker. So he's now the Deputy Head of Policy of the Rajatnam School of International Affairs. Great pleasure to have you, Adrian.
Thank you, Professor. I will try to focus on 3 points, right? Since there's but my 3 points a bit, I will cheat a bit because the 3 points will have other things involved in it. So I want to elaborate a bit on, can you all hear me? I want to elaborate a bit on the geopolitical thing that Professor Tomiko has mentioned earlier. In my school, this is one topic that is focusing a lot of attention because it is one single relationship. The United States and China relationship has great impact, not just in our region, but actually throughout the whole world. I came back from a couple of conferences over the last 1-2 months on the Indian Ocean, and every panel, somehow China is mentioned. The Belt Road Initiative is being mentioned. The implication of the debt trap on the countries, all these are being debated. And China sent a lot of their senior officials to go there and defend China's position on the Belt Road Initiative. They say it's economic driven, it's not a security, national, it's not a political initiative. But I want to go back to the point about Donald Trump. I think Donald Trump is a symptom of a larger issue. I think the America today, which in Southeast Asia we have benefited, right? A benign superpower. We have benefited, we have grown, and China has benefited from the benign presence of the United States. We could grow economically, we could trade each other. But the America today is no longer the America that we know, at least in my opinion. I remember John F. Kennedy once said, right? America is willing to pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe to assure the survival and the success of liberty. That America, I think, is not here today. It's exhausted by the long wars that he fought against terror, and it's still fighting. America is still in Afghanistan today. It's still in Iraq. It's still involved in many of these conflicts in the Middle East. So America today is no longer the same America. If China thinks that when Donald Trump leaves, America will go back to what it was before, China might be very surprised. As Prof. Koh mentioned earlier, the thought of what Vice President Pence has said, it came before Pence. It came before Trump. Obama was elected because American people wanted change. Donald Trump was the change that they asked for. He has come up. And to me, in Donald Trump's mind, he has so many successes over the last few months. The negotiation, he has succeeded in Canada and Mexico, right? He's now sending his sixth Secretary of State to Saudi Arabia, which they will resolve the issue of the missing journalists. So if China thinks that America will be the same, China should be a bit concerned, because I think the ideas that Donald Trump has put on the table is not going to disappear. We will have to live with the America of today. And what does that mean for China? The other issue that was not discussed earlier is that the fundamental question I have, at least something which I think about, is how would China respond? President Xi Jinping is from China, and China is not structured the way as America. Donald Trump says a lot of things, a lot of people ignore him, right? They see the actions, not the words, the actions of his people, his Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State. Those are the key people you need to watch what's happening on the ground. But Xi Jinping is now the #1 most powerful leader since possibly Deng Xiaoping's period. And somebody mentioned to me that now in China, there's a single point of failure because all top decisions will go to Xi Jinping. What does that mean? How will Xi Jinping respond to the pressure from the United States? If you see what happened in Mexico and Canada, all Donald Trump is asking for is a little victory. Then he'll declare to the whole American media that I have won. But actually it's very little, right? The Mexicans will say it's very little, but he has declared victory. But can Xi Jinping deliver that? How would his Communist Party of China react to the decision if he has done that? So to me, we should not just watch America. We should watch how China will respond. So now there's a lot of speculation. Would President Trump and Xi Jinping meet at the sidelines of the G20? Would Donald Trump say, I now have a best friend again? Right? He met Kim Jong-un once, and he's now best friend to Kim Jong-un. Right? But I think Donald Trump naturally gravitates towards strong leaders and what he perceives as strong leaders. But even that, there's no guarantee of success, right? Xi Jinping is seen as a strong leader, but yet Donald Trump is driven by other necessities and what he wants as an outcome to show to everybody that I am a very good president. And that's why you say UN. I am a very good president, right? I got a lot of successes. That's an issue where people laugh in the UN, and he reacted to that. The second point I want to talk about, this is a geopolitical part. The second point I'll talk about, what is ASEAN to us, right? Actually, whatever it is, no matter how pessimistic, ASEAN has really brought us where we are today. Let's not forget that. As a region, we have benefited from the ASEAN as an organization. Fundamentally, it's an organization that allows leaders to meet each other, talk to each other, and get to know each other. I always say, if you don't know the person, how are you going to solve any problem? And if you meet the person once, in 3 years, how are you going to solve your problem? You need to meet them regularly so that on the corridor, when I see you, I can go out to you and say that we have a problem. And they do that at the sidelines of ASEAN meetings. They do it in the main meeting. You see the leaders stepping out, going and talk to another leader. They're doing side meetings. And then they could even meet anywhere, including in toilets and so on, where they can have a small little chats on issues that they want to talk away from other people. I think that is very important. The second thing that is very important, talk too fast. The second thing that's very important is all the economic benefits. We have benefited a lot. Again, I just got back from Sri Lanka, and an Indian academic said that, do you know, it's cheaper for India to trade with Brazil than for India to trade with its neighbors. Intra-trade between India and its neighbors is only, within South Asia area is only 5%. ASEAN is 25%. Can it be better? Yeah, of course. But it's 25%, and it's 5% for the Indian Ocean area because of the connectivity. So where we are today, we are actually far from where we are in 1967. Right? So we have benefited from this. Is ASEAN perfect? No. No organization in this world is perfect. Right? We talk about consensus, we talk about non-interference, but if there is no consensus, we have 10 countries, very diverse countries, with all sorts of political setup. We have absolute monarchies, we have parliamentary democracy, right? We have all sorts. How within the country they come to their own internal consensus is complicated. So consensus is not perfect, but what's the alternative? ASEAN minus X, where some ASEAN countries will go first and maybe 1 or 2 countries will be left behind. But that is still contingent on having the agreement of the X countries, that we can proceed with that. So on economic issue, possible. I don't see that possible in a political issue, given the differences and diversity of the countries. Non-interference. I think through creative ways, either through bilateral, we can make a difference without violating the non-interference. And I think a very important point is also personalities. Personalities of ASEAN Secretary Generals, personalities of foreign ministers, like Foreign Minister Marty from Indonesia, the role that they play individually to go and persuade. Diplomacy is crucial. I'm not saying this because I'm a former foreign service officer, but I was told that a good diplomat is somebody that will tell you to go to hell, and you actually believe him, and you're looking forward to it, right? So I think as diplomats, we all have to go out and persuade the other side. So it's not easy, like the situation in Myanmar. It's definitely not easy, as you know, the word cannot even be mentioned at all in some meetings. But yet, there is a humanitarian crisis over there. What can ASEAN do to help alleviate some of these issues? And these are really complex. And it's not the first time, right, where non-interference is being talked about. The other issue that, of course, we need to think is that at this very uncertain time, ASEAN must ensure that it sticks together and carry out its commitments. Implementing whatever you agree upon is a crucial point. If you agree to carry out certain reforms on your economic structure, you have to do it, right? It's not easy. This is a time of great uncertainty, but in my opinion, it's also a time for great opportunities. Former Foreign Minister George Yeo recently wrote in a newspaper talking about how individual ASEAN countries can benefit from the current tensions between the United States and China from a very trade investment perspective, the China plus one type of strategy and so on. I think there are opportunities, but I have one caveat. As long as the United States and China, they don't go into a hot conflict. If it's a hot conflict and they say, choose a side, then I think we'll be in trouble. But as of now, I don't think China wants a conflict, right? I don't think Donald Trump is interested in a conflict. He just wants an outcome to some of his pressure on tariffs and so on. Will it escalate? Of course, there's great uncertainty, and there's nothing much ASEAN can do about that, because these are big powers. But what we can do is we get our house in order. And how do we get house in order? I already mentioned, but another important point which I want to touch about is like what Prof. Simon mentioned earlier. We have to get to know our neighbors, right? ASEAN cannot be an elite government-driven organization. The future of ASEAN belongs to all of us, especially you guys who are so much younger. The future is in your hands. If you wait for the government to tell you what to do for ASEAN, I think we are in trouble, right? With technology, we can cut across countries in ASEAN. We can communicate, right? All these technological advances are yours. You can make full use of them. Go ahead. Create initiative. Today, I met a group of Filipinos that asked me, what should we do? And say that, go, come up with initiative. Look, I mean, you want funds? Crowdsourcing. Don't wait for the government to raise funds for you so that your university can engage with another university. Get to know your neighbors. Speak a language from our region. Go and learn Tagalog. At least go and learn Bahasa Indonesia, Bahasa Malaysia. Understand our neighbor. This is crucial because our future is in this region. We can't go away from here. And if you ask me, can we have a different organization? Very difficult. This one is 51 years, you know. We took 51 years to come to ASEAN today. You want to create another ASEAN? Can ASEAN be better? Yes, of course. So when you go up, some of you, please enter into government service, enter into politics, so that you too can make a difference. All right? Don't sit there, wait for things to come down from the top. Start from the below. And I think I'll stop a bit earlier. Thank you.
I want to reinforce the advice that Adrian has given to our student. I would encourage our student, the Singapore student, to do 3 things. During your stay in Tembusu College, please make a friend from another ASEAN country. Yeah, it's an opportunity for you here. There are many students from our neighboring country. Please make at least one friend from another country, another ASEAN country. Because when you grow up, it is very important if you're an ASEAN network, you know. The second advice Adrian gave is very good. Learn another regional language. The easiest language to learn is the Bahasa, spoken in Brunei, Malaysia, Indonesia, Singapore. Please learn Bahasa Malaysia, Bahasa Indonesia. And third, instead of holidaying in the West, please holiday in our neighboring country. I want to give you one example of what I did, because I want to tell you that I actually walked my talk. When I became chairman of the National Heritage Board, and I was chairman for 9 years, I told myself that every year I will lead a delegation from all of our museums and national archives to visit a different ASEAN country. In the first year, there were a lot of protests by my colleagues. They rather that I take them to visit New York, Paris, London, or Tokyo. And I said, no. Singapore can only be strong if we are strong in ASEAN. So the first year, I brought them to visit Indonesia. I began in Bali, took them to Bali, and then to Jogja, then to Jakarta. And you know, one of the very bright young Malay curator at the National Museum came up to me in Bali and said, Prof, thank you very much for taking us to Indonesia. I never thought a place like this existed in Indonesia. I mean, she had never been to Bali, you know. I mean, Bali is such a wonderful paradise. You know, a living example of Hindu civilization in a Muslim majority country. And when I brought them to Jogja and showed them Borobudur and Prambanan, it was another eye-opener, you know. And then to bring them to visit all the young artists in Jogja and Jakarta. Then the next year I brought them to visit Vietnam, you know, and show them the great variety that Vietnam is, the treasures that they have. So it really opened their eyes, you know. So I urge you, you know, in your time in Tembusu College, please make at least one friend from another ASEAN country. Try to learn another language and holiday in our neighboring country. Our final speaker, our anchorman, is a very dear friend, Ambassador Tan Hang Seng. Ambassador Tan is a very distinguished member of the Foreign Service. He has served in Thailand, but it is his karma to be in Cairo. He has served 3 times in Cairo, the last time as our Singapore's ambassador to Egypt. And for the last 5 years, he has done a super job as Singapore's permanent representative to ASEAN. Hang Seng, thank you for coming from Jakarta, for joining us this evening. Please come and speak to us.
A very good evening, Ambassador Koh, dear residents of Tembusu College. First, I must thank Ambassador Koh for inviting me to this evening's forum. I've requested to speak last because I hope that my preceding speakers, and they have met my expectations, they have covered all the important points, so I can afford to be brief. What I intend to do this evening is essentially to take a different approach, because you have heard the 3 speakers before me talking about ASEAN from a strategic level. What I hope to do this evening is really to bring ASEAN from 30,000 feet to 3 feet to the ground level, because that is really what the CPR does in Jakarta. But before I go any further, I just want to have a show of hands. How many of you know what is the CPR? Except those in the front row. Any guest? Would anybody like to hazard a guess? What is the CPR? It's not the thing that you do when somebody has a heart attack. The CPR actually stands for the Committee of Permanent Representatives to ASEAN. My objective this evening is twofold. First, I want to give you a better understanding of what the CPR is, because it is a relatively young and relatively unknown mechanism of ASEAN, but nonetheless a very important mechanism. I'm saying it not because I'm a member of the CPR. And second, I want to share with you some of the dynamics within ASEAN and between ASEAN and the great powers at the ground level in CPR. So the first question, what is the CPR? In a nutshell, the CPR, or Committee of Permanent Representatives to ASEAN, comprises the 10 ambassadors that ASEAN member states have appointed as their permanent representatives to ASEAN. And you may ask, why are you all in Jakarta? We are in Jakarta because the ASEAN Secretariat is located there. Hence, in Jakarta, you have 2 sets of ambassadors. You have those ambassadors who are accredited to Indonesia and those who are accredited to ASEAN. What do we do? Essentially, the permanent representative's role is twofold. First, we have to protect and advance our respective countries' interests in ASEAN. So in the case of Singapore, what I do is I try to advance Singapore's interest in ASEAN. We will have both defensive and offensive interests, and my job is to make sure that our interests are taken care. The second important role of the CPR is to advance ASEAN community building. This is easier said than done, because the challenge is really to find the right balance. You may ask, if my job is to defend Singapore's interest, how can I do it in a way that will also advance ASEAN's community building efforts? And that, finding the right balance in doing that is really important. And this dilemma, in a way, was captured very well, very presciently by our first foreign minister, Rajaratnam. at the birth of ASEAN in 1968, when he said that for ASEAN to survive, ASEAN member states must marry national thinking with regional thinking. And this, I must underline, is still the fundamental challenge for ASEAN. The CPR was established in 2009. It came about because we established the ASEAN Charter in 2008, and for those of you who do not know, Ambassador Tommy Koh played a key role in bringing about the ASEAN Charter. So he has a lot of responsibility on his shoulder. In essence, the CPR plays three primary roles. The first is to enhance coordination across the three community pillars. Do you all know that ASEAN has got three community pillars? Do you know what they are? Anybody? The first pillar is the political security pillar. The second is the economic pillar. And the third is the ASEAN social cultural pillars. So one of the role envisaged for the CPR is that we will coordinate across these three pillars. And as you have heard earlier, and in many of the analyses that you read, it will appear to you that ASEAN's challenges or primary challenges come from outside. Pressures from the great powers. How do we deal with the great powers? How do we maintain room for maneuver when there is this competition between China and the US? Of course, that is a big elephant in the room. But what I want to say here is that besides having to navigate these external pressures, another very important thing that ASEAN must do is how do we resolve internal tensions and contradictions. So it's not just external pressures, but also how ASEAN member states deal with the tensions. The second important role that the CPR does is to coordinate ASEAN's relations with our external partners. And in Jakarta, besides the 10 ASEAN ambassadors who are known as permanent representatives, there are 11 ambassadors from our external partners who are accredited to ASEAN. And do you know that ASEAN actually has 10 dialogue partners? The 10 dialogue partners are US, China, Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand, Russia, India, EU, and Canada. And all of them have dedicated ambassadors in Jakarta. In addition to the 10, there is also Norway, which is a sectorial dialogue partner who has also appointed an ambassador in Jakarta. So one of the key roles of the CPR is to be the focal point in handling ASEAN external relations. And the third important role that the CPR does is to oversee and support the ASEAN Secretariat. The ASEAN Secretariat, as you can imagine, is not like the EU Secretariat in Brussels. In fact, it is fairly lean. We only have 380 staff, all in all, at all levels, compared to the 32,000 staff that you have in the EU Secretariat in Brussels. So that is what the CPR is all about. The second question that I want to address here is what are the challenges facing ASEAN? You have heard from the earlier speakers, they have identified very many important aspects, but I'll just like to summarize them in 5 C's. The first C is cohesion. The second C is credibility. The third C is coordination. The fourth C, of course, is centrality. and the last C is connection. These are all interrelated. Very often we hear people talking about ASEAN centrality. But how can ASEAN be central if we are not cohesive, if we are not well coordinated? And if we don't do those things well, we will not be credible. So these are serious challenges which ASEAN must address. In the interest of time, I have only 5 more minutes. Let me quickly move on to the third point, and that is, how does ASEAN deal with the great powers? Essentially, ASEAN has created a regional architecture. We have provided platforms that all the major external players who have an interest in this region can engage. You must have heard of the ASEAN Regional Forum, the ARF. You must have heard of the ASEAN Plus 3, and of course the East Asian Summit. I just want to focus on the East Asian Summit because this has now emerged as the most important regional platform. The East Asian Summit comprises 18 countries, 10 ASEAN countries plus 8 of our dialogue partners. The 2 dialogue partners who are not members of the EAS, you like to guess who they are? Come on. Anybody? Have some audience participation before you fall asleep? Anybody? Make a guess. Korea? Did I hear Korea? Okay, the 2 dialogue partners who are not members of the EAS are EU and Canada. So besides these 2, all the other dialogue partners who are essentially ASEAN's most important external partners come together. And we have established in Jakarta a mechanism known as the East AS Ambassadors Meeting in Jakarta. It's a very young platform, but it has taken on very important roles. It is responsible for negotiating and finalizing all the EAS documents, outcome documents, and these are leaders level documents. They have included the Sunny Land Principles, which was issued at the ASEAN-US Summit, the Sochi Declaration, the Delhi Declaration, the Sydney Declaration. And here at the EAS Ambassadors Meeting, you really see the dynamics playing out. The dynamics of competition between China and the US. I recall last year when we were negotiating a statement and the Trump administration had just assumed office, to the surprise of everybody in the room, the US delegation took a very strident position on free trade. They refused to accept any reference to trade or foreign direct investment. And coming from the US, which has been the bastion of free trade and investment, it was a shock. They insisted that free trade can only be referred to if it is free and reciprocal trade. So these are the dynamics that happened. The other very hot button issue which we deal with is the South China Sea issue. And here you can see the dynamics, the competition between China and the US, but not just the US, but also Japan, Australia, to a lesser extent, India. And in this arena, the alliances can change according to the issues at hand. A good example, we are now in the midst of negotiating an EAS leader statement on ICT security. And here there is an alliance between Russia and India. So these alliances, coincidence of interest would shift according to the issues at hand. I have another 30 seconds. So let me just close by saying that ASEAN has often been criticized for being slow, sometimes for being ineffective. And the reason for that has often been blamed on consensus. But I think it is more than just consensus. It's also the challenge of coordination, also the challenge of ASEAN member states being able to marry national thinking with regional thinking. Thank you very much.
At this point in the program, we invite questions from the audience, and there's microphones at either end. And when you get up to the microphone, we ask only that you tell us not only your name, but what college you're in. It's quite obvious you have a Tembusu t-shirt, of course. You might also want to mention your department. But all questions are open, and they're open to any member of the panel.
Before I call on the student, may I ask whether any of my distinguished guests in the front row wish to ask any questions? Anybody? Sharon? Yes. Could somebody give a microphone to Sharon, please? Yeah.
So I was told that research has shown that if a lady asks a question in an audience, then more women will ask questions.
Oh.
So I hope that I'll start off and then more women will be encouraged to ask questions. Thank you, speakers, and thank you, Prof. Ko. I think it's been a very enlightening session. And my question, of course, it points to the elephant in the room, which is the Rohingya issue. And I was very taken by what Mo said about constructive interference by ASEAN. And essentially, principle of non-interference is a legal norm that's much cherished. And for a long time, ASEAN has also upheld this principle of non-interference, although we are told that there's much quiet diplomacy going behind the scenes. And Mo's point is also about the taking back the narrative of centrality in ASEAN, and I think the other speakers have also talked about how centrality is dependent on coordination and on reaching consensus. So what I really like to know is that actually, as of a few years ago, we've already been having problems within ASEAN, in particular on the South China Sea issue, and also a few summits ago where we failed to even issue a communique because Cambodia had objected. Are these cracks which are appearing in ASEAN going to deepen further? And what can we do in this common thread that you've all spoken about? What can we do to strengthen that cohesion and that unity and to prevent that from appearing publicly? And in relation to that, how can we do more in constructive interference to help the Rohingya refugee issue? Thank you.
Actually, there are two questions. A specific question of Rohingyas, which I'll ask Mo to respond to. But your other question, I would ask Hang Seng to respond to. Because you also, Simon. Because the other question is, from time to time, ASEAN faces issue that divide the family, whether it's the South China Sea, whether it's Rohingya, whether it's some years ago, the welfare of the Muslim minority in southern Thailand, the so-called extrajudicial killings in the Philippines and so on, you know. So the question for Hang Seng and for Simon is, will ASEAN remain united in the face of these divisive issues? Yeah. Mo, you want to go first on Rohingyas? Huh? You're fine. Okay. Then you want to go first, Hang Seng? You go first. Okay. The microphone there.
Yeah, I spend a lot of time in Myanmar actually. We deal not only with the advisors and ministers, but also with members of parliament and a broad cross-section. Actually, I've written about it as well after looking at a lot of the investor sentiment, and Singapore is one of the largest investors in Myanmar. And I've had the pleasure of meeting the Chinese ambassador in Yangon, the capital, the main city of Myanmar. So from that perspective, I mean, I defer to Mo, but I would say that first, this issue is doubly difficult because the Western press has made it a very, almost a personal attack upon Aung San Suu Kyi. You know, talk about her, not just trying to put things right, but berating her, you know, her peace prize, etc., etc. And I think in a sense, it's given her very little space to come back. The second reason I feel quite some sympathy for Daw Suu is that in the public of Myanmar, this is not something I agree with, but very broadly in cross-sections of society, they have no sympathy for the Rakhine State Muslims or the Rohingya. Even very pleasant, professional people who are sane on so many issues see sort of red-ish blood, you know, in their eyes when this issue is raised. So, given that she's democratically elected, the space between the angry West and some angry ASEAN people and her own people is a very hard space to navigate. The second point I try to make quickly is that I'm a lawyer, so constitutions and courts matter to me. The courts are not under her control, and the Constitution gives the control of defense, home affairs, and border affairs to the military. So not just the raw power of the military, which they do have the raw power, but the legal system protects and anchors in the military, who also have 25% of parliament. So again, what she can do is very circumscribed. The issue I think she can move on is to try to help deal with the humanitarian issue, which is more emphasized. The issue the West wants us to move most on is the culpability issue, to go after a few generals. The wisdom of ASEAN, I think, should be more in the second part of the 3 points that Minister Balakrishnan made in the UN. Not so much the accountability at this point of time, but to focus on helping the almost 1 million people who have crossed the border into very difficult conditions in Cox's Bazar. And this period particularly, with the monsoon going on, there is a really human tragedy happening near us.
Well, you seem to be an eloquent defender of Daw Suu, and that the public opinion doesn't allow her to take a more courageous, more principled stand. But the world, including our own Malaysian colleagues, are very disappointed in her leadership, you know. I mean, given all the constraints, could she have done more, Simon, or not?
Well, I think first, the narrative has been lost by Daw Suu and her government of what they have done. Most people have never heard what they've done. So let me briefly put this on the table. And Mo, again, if you want to chime in, I don't know how you feel about this, please do. They have actually built a better infrastructure to deal with anybody coming back. They have actually brought in the UN humanitarian agencies to the area. And they've started cooperating in the last few months. So, and before that, there was Daw Suu who helped commission the Kofi Annan report. The late Secretary General of the UN put out a very good report which suggests many of the right things to do to heal this wound and to get the process moving. They have adopted about maybe 90% of the report. The most difficult points remain. So I don't think that these three things would have happened if the civilian government of Daw Suu was not trying to move the issue despite those impediments I talked about. So I think she's trying, but to come out on sort of a soapbox and yell at the military would probably be politically unwise. It would win her a lot of kudos for standing her ground, the moral issue, but probably would be ineffective.
Okay, I'll add my take on it. And well, first of all, Simon, thank you, as Prof. Tommy has said, for being an eloquent advocate for the difficulties that Myanmar, under the NLD government, under the leadership of Dosu, faces. But I think Sharon's question was about what more can we see in terms of constructive interference regarding the Rohingya issue, which again, I think this is the issue, one of the issues right now that are in international attention that is testing ASEAN's centrality, ASEAN's credibility, and of course the projection that ASEAN has in terms of upholding its consensus and its constructive engagement principles. Simon has highlighted quite clearly the humanitarian aspect versus the accountability or the culpability. And again, this is something that has continued from 20 years ago when ASEAN was justifying to its Western interlocutors that rather than talk about human rights and corner a country into adhering to international norms and rights, and punishing that country for it will only serve to isolate it further, and rather ASEAN's preference is to have that country in at the discussion table to talk about it. So I mean that has always been ASEAN's approach, the dialogue, the emphasis on dialogue. And I think in the case of the Rohingya issue, dialogue is important because, as Simon has highlighted, there are very nuanced situations on the ground that probably most of us following practically blow-by-blow accounts that the media reports are showing may not be able to get, I guess, that whole comprehensive sense. Now, I'm not saying that the media reports are not true. After all, the media's role is to bring to us what is happening, is to tell us the truth, to investigate the details into what's happening. But in this day and age of the immediacy of information and the instant gratification of reacting to it, when information and access to it is being broadened and flattened in ways that I would never have imagined when I was your age growing up, I think we also need to sift through. I mean, it's a barrage of information coming through. So Simon has highlighted, I think, the political constraints that Dosu faces in a situation, in a country where the transformation to a fully fledged democracy is not happening. And so Simon has also highlighted the constitutional constraints of the commander-in-chief being able to nominate directly the Minister for Defense, the Minister for Home Affairs, and the Minister for Border Affairs and National Races. Now, these are the ministries that are most directly involved in dealing with the situation in northern Rakhine, where the majority of the Rohingya community live. But a little known point, even among us in ASEAN, is the very tense relations between the state government in Rakhine and the central government in Naypyidaw. So we have people in Rakhine who have very real concerns from their point of view of what's happening in their state. And this is also going to be linked to, I think, some of the allusions that all the speakers have been making to the rise of populism and essentially, well, figuratively, why people throw rocks. People throw rocks because they want attention. And Ian Bremmer has actually talked about it in his latest publication called Us and Them. But essentially, when you want to seek a government's attention and you do not have a channel, when you don't have recourse or you don't know how, that's when people get out onto the streets. We saw this happen in 1988 in Myanmar, Burma then.
But it's also, I think, the way of pushing back against the government. So in Rakhine, the state government has has a negative type of relationship with the central government in Naypyidaw. In fact, in Rakhine State, that's the only region in the whole of Myanmar where the NLD did not win a majority in the 2015 elections. So that's one factor that I think all of us looking for a constructive interference solution in Myanmar need to think about. What are the relations between center and periphery in Myanmar's internal governance structure? And the other factor, I think that's the real elephant in the room, is really the role and reach of the military. So when they have owned or professed ownership of national security and start constructing a narrative along the lines of national security, and living in the times that we live in where we do see a rising tide of more right-wing attitudes, I have called this in some of the articles I've written as me first, transactional type of attitudes. And we're seeing this emanating out of a country that I think in terms of democracy, in terms of open economy, most of us in this region have aspired to. We're seeing the transactional me first attitudes being celebrated, coming out again of people who have serious concerns, who have thrown rocks to get the government's attention. So if we see this happening in the United States, then these transactional me-first attitudes somehow become justified in terms of moral equivalency. And this is what we see happening in Myanmar. If Trump can say that, why are you trying to point fingers at us is the kind of attitude that I think, well, Simon has said, the pushback that you see from the man in the street, who over the past 70 years has been given one type of narrative about a community. And you talk about, Simon, you alluded to that. But, you know, I don't know. You see, I actually went and did the National Geographic DNA test because I got a bit fed up at one point in time about ethnicity, citizenship, and identity. And so, yes. So, and of course, Senator Warren's 1/64th to 1/1000th something percentage of Native American, well, that piece of news today, listening to it on the radio on the way to work, struck me. And I like to share this with audiences to really think about why are we hung up on certain things. But then again, in Myanmar, again, ethnicity, citizenship, and identity are conflated, intertwined, and very much linked. So that's why I did the test, mainly because on my mother's side, I'm fourth generation Chinese. And there was discrimination, marginalization of ethnic groups such as, well, Chinese, Indian communities living in Myanmar under the years of when there was huge nationalization or Burmanization drives. So, okay, my DNA test, the results, I'm 60% Northeast Asian, 35%, around 35% Southeast Asian, some 4+% Southwest Asian, and about 2 or so % Neanderthal. So there you go. But I identify myself as someone, you know, living in Myanmar, and I am a citizen of Myanmar. But on my identity card, because my father is Burmese, I'm listed as Burma. And that's another thing. See, when you are required to list both your race and religion on your identity card, again, the whole notion of ethnicity, identity, and citizenship becomes very much conflated. So maybe just to end this long...
Wait, but I must quarrel with you one point. You mustn't criticize the role of the media in Myanmar, because if Reuters had not reported about the atrocities committed by the military the world wouldn't know about
Oh,
it.
no,
You know?
I
Yeah.
wasn't criticizing.
okay,
I was
okay.
just saying
Ah.
we need to know which one, which medium
of course.
information.
Yes.
And that's where I think, you know, you
Yeah.
don't wholesale swallow what is
of course,
shared,
of course.
because this is what's happening in
Yeah,
Myanmar,
okay.
Prof. Tommy.
Yes.
Facebook has become the medium of sharing news that is unfiltered,
news,
unchecked,
yeah.
and unverified, but people are swallowing it as practically gospel truth, and it's only recently that people have realized it. Very quickly, the humanitarian aspect that ASEAN is focusing on, I think, is the right way to go. And there is, of course, precedent from 2008, which was the humanitarian crisis caused by Cyclone Nargis. But I'd like to make a differentiation here. Again, Simon has also highlighted that the community in question right now is a community that many in the country, due to certain narratives, seem to have no affinity with. And what happened in 2008 was a natural disaster. Natural disasters, yes, even though with climate change are occurring more frequently and with more intensity, they are still random events. But what's happening with the Rohingya communities in Rakhine really is a complex emergency with chronic characteristics. It's not the first time that an exodus has happened, although it is the largest exodus ever to have happened. So I think what ASEAN does really is to continue that dialogue with Myanmar, to really look at the constraints in Rakhine itself and try to see where humanitarian actions at the community level, at the village level can help. But then you see, the rest of us around ASEAN can also help in different ways, probably not going into Myanmar, but actually looking at what are the opportunities we can do to work with the young people, women, youth, in the different camps in Malaysia or in Indonesia where there are Rohingya communities. And of course, repatriation is important. And the parallel is there is also a repatriation process going on the east side of Myanmar, which is the refugees from Thailand. And I think we should probably look at what lessons can be drawn from Myanmar's discussions, dialogue, and cooperation with Thailand in bringing back the refugees, which have been in Thailand for decades as well. I'm sorry to have taken so long.
Sorry. Han Seng, a quick one on whether we can stay united in the light of these fissures.
A quick one. Let me just go back to the point about what S. Rajaratnam said about marrying national thinking with regional thinking. I think that is the crux of the issue. I am optimistic that ASEAN would not break up, primarily because I think every ASEAN member states see value in being a member of ASEAN. In other words, we are all better off with ASEAN than without. Just to share an anecdote with you, somebody, I think was Sharon, made reference to the 2012 ministerial meeting when for the first time ASEAN was not able to issue a joint communique because of the South China Sea issue, and that was because Cambodia, as we know, was acting at the behest of China. And I told my colleague, Cambodian colleague, that, hey, look, you must not kill the golden goose or the goose that lay the golden egg. Because if we think about it, and this was what I told him rather bluntly, that China is interested in you to such an extent, not because you are Cambodia, but because Cambodia is a member of ASEAN. So it serves Cambodia interests to make sure that ASEAN does not fragment, doesn't break up, because if ASEAN does, every one of us would lose.
Thank you, Han Seng. Any other question from the front bench? Yes.
Hi.
We'll go to the student. Okay, let's go to the student. Yes, we have a woman.
No, yeah.
Yeah, please. We'll take the three questions.
Okay.
Yes.
Hello. Thank you for your insights today, and I really enjoyed hearing all your different thoughts. My name is Violet. I'm a year 3 student in Southeast Asian Studies, and I just wanted to ask about what AP Tay said just now. He mentioned about how Singaporeans must be prepared to travel the region, and I was curious to find out, like, are we looking at Singaporeans setting up bases in these various ASEAN countries, and like, will this need for travel be on a long-term or on a short-term basis? Because I'm thinking, like, if our ideal state of ASEAN is to see sort of like an exchange of like human capital in that sense, where like you have a Singaporean community in Indonesia, a Thai community in Myanmar, that sort of thing, where we have like sort of like a little like Singapore in all these other countries, or are we looking at a short-term basis where like
thank you.
we
I'll ask Adrian to respond to you.
Yeah.
Because I think he's urging young people to travel and
And
visit
then
other ASEAN countries.
if I could add another
Can you just
question
ask
to
one
this?
question at a
Okay,
time?
no problem. Yeah.
The next question, please.
Okay.
Hi, my name is Dennis. I'm a year 3 student in Tembusu College. Earlier this year, Russia and China completed a military exercise called Vostok 2018. What do you think this signals to and implies for ASEAN?
Russia and China conducted a joint naval exercise, right?
Yes.
Is that your question? So
The
what are the
military
implications for ASEAN? Okay, third question.
Hi, my name is Buck, Year 3 Political Science students, and I am, as what Prof. Ko said, is a friend from ASEAN. So my question is on what is ASEAN position on climate change, and how, what is the progress that ASEAN have been done in coordinating, consulting, reaching a consensus regarding issues. Thank you.
Thank you. Good question. ASEAN position on climate change. Yes, please.
Hi, good evening, speakers. I'm Jua, a Year 1 student residing at Tembusu. My question is that with Singapore spearheading the newly launched ASEAN Smart Cities Network, how will this network change the economies of different ASEAN countries in this digital era? And in addition, how receptive are ASEAN countries to this change? Thank you.
Thank you. Good question. So we have 4 questions, right? One on travel, which I'll ask Adrian to respond to. On the climate change, I asked Simon to respond to. On the, whether there's any strategic implication about this joint naval exercise by China and Russia, maybe I'll ask Hang Sing to respond to, and then you do the question. Okay, so Adrian, you start first.
Why is there a need to be short-term and long-term, right? You do trips short-term for your holidays, long-term in future when you start to work. If there's opportunities for you to work in the region, go for it. In fact, when you talk about little Singapore communities in Southeast Asia, there are many little Singapore communities in Southeast Asia. Right? You go to Ho Chi Minh City, you see them. They are everywhere, they're small little communities. So you should not be limited by short-term or long-term. My point is that you need to know our ASEAN neighbors. Don't always go to London. Don't go always to Australia. Go to your neighbors, either for work, play, and increasingly, even marriage.
Thank you, Adrian. So consider marrying a boyfriend or girlfriend for another ASEAN country. Simon, you want to talk about ASEAN position on climate change?
Thank you, Prof. On climate change policy, I'd say it's very early days for ASEAN. The good news is that all 10 countries have taken on commitments at the Paris Agreement, and they're quite varied. I think also the good news is that more and more they've come to understand that our region is highly vulnerable to climate change. They've done studies, the Asian Development Bank has done studies. Now, some of the bad news. We haven't got a united position. So far, most times when we go to the climate change negotiations, we all sort of splinter, maybe have a breakfast together and splinter. But it's time to change. This year, since Singapore was a chairman, our Minister for Environment and Water Resources, Masagos, held one of the first meeting, I would say, of the climate change action. It's Singapore's year of climate change action. Second, private sector is starting to move. From Singapore, we can see that investments going into our region are starting to debate issues about whether those investments are good for the environment or not, what they call green finance. And here, my think tank has done a major paper with the MAS about the opportunities in ASEAN. There will be some questions about some industries we should not get into, whether coal-fired plants should be financed from Singapore or by other banks in the region. I think it's still early days, but I have not lost optimism. When you look at the two giant economies of our region, Asia, India and China have shifted their positions dramatically over the last decade. They were both naysayers. They're now both trying to lead on the new innovative energy and other solutions to the climate change problem.
Thank you, Simon. Hang Seng.
The question about the Russian-Chinese naval exercise in the South China Sea, I think reflects a bigger phenomena, and that is a contest, a competition between China and the US, and also some of the other major regional players like Australia, Japan. What are the implications? I think what we are seeing is the South China Sea hotting up as an arena of competition. What can ASEAN do? I think ASEAN has taken steps to make sure that this competition doesn't boil over. We have developed confidence building measures like Qs, the code for unplanned encounters at sea. ASEAN and China have also conducted joint naval exercises. So these are the steps that ASEAN have taken to make sure that temperatures do not boil over. And these are the kind of things that ASEAN can do and can contribute in a meaningful way.
The question was on the Smart Cities Network initiative, which was launched this year during Singapore's chairmanship of ASEAN, and how will it change ASEAN? I've been looking at urbanization issues in the different ASEAN member states in Southeast Asian countries, and I've also been looking at the connectivity potential and the implications arising out of ASEAN's master plan on connectivity, which is not just about roads and rails or seamless systems, but also bringing greater people-to-people interactions. So it also links to, I think, Violet's earlier question about traveling in the region. The Smart Cities Network, I think, is the first time that ASEAN has actually gone down to the city level. ASEAN, being an intergovernmental organization, is all about government-to-government discussions, and that's where Mr. Rajaratnam's dictum of marrying national and regional thinking is important, because sometimes what's important nationally may not be what is important as shared by your regional colleagues. So that syncing of national priorities with regional commitments is something that ASEAN, through these 51 years of cooperation, as an intergovernmental organization, dealing with reaching the decision-making, dealing with decision-making through consultation and consensus, has always had to face. So as I was saying, the Smart Cities Network is the first time that ASEAN is going to the city level and connecting cities. And I'd like to see that as also connecting the dots. And if we look at it in the context of what's happening right now with these trade tensions that are being manifested between an existing global power and a power rising in this region, which the existing power somehow feels that is threatening its act. This is where I think ASEAN can find an opportunity in the kind of possible shifts in supply chains globally that could derail or complicate what's going on here for ASEAN economic integration. And it's also the first time that ASEAN is taking decision-making on planning a sustainable future of, and the livability of each of these dots in the chain that connects ASEAN. The planning of it, ASEAN is taking it also to better consultation and coordination between the parties that matter. So there is the private sector entities, the planning officials, who will of course need to be responsible and accountable for the administration and the overall policies, but financing it, implementing it will be partnered by private sector entities. And it's not just each country, each city going it alone with the private sector or the investors in their countries. It's actually connecting investors and city administrators across the chain. But of course, because ASEAN in the aggregate is different from ASEAN individually, there will be different priorities. What's important for Singapore is not going to be what the mayor of Luang Prabang wants for a smart city. I think what Luang Prabang is grappling with is how to get tourists not to fall into cracks in pavements in walking around Luang Prabang, which is a heritage city. So for them, to be smart is also related to bringing more visitors, bringing more tourists, which is different again from, say, the mayor of Mandalay, who will look at how does the Mandalay City Administrative Committee deal with the different coordination issues, which again, of course, as Ambassador Tan Seng has said, in ASEAN is also an issue. So I'm quite excited about the Smart Cities Network. And I think in ASEAN, there is this willingness to continue implementing an initiative that is launched in 1 year of chairmanship through to the next year, because ASEAN goes by different milestones. And so these regional initiatives will, I think, continue beyond the year in which they were launched, and I don't think they should be conflated with the chairman country that launched it.
Okay, let's take 4 more questions, and then we'll bring this to a close. Are there 4 more questions? Can you please go to the microphone? We start with you first.
Hi, good evening, speakers. Thank you for your presentation. My name is Marisa. I'm a year 1 graduate student in political science. I'd just like to ask, it seems to me that the tension amongst big powers like US and China is viewed as a threat to ASEAN. However, China seems to be looking at ASEAN as a non-threatening power, and I'm looking at us as a good alternative market where they are boosting physical connectivity through the Belt and Road Initiative. So I would like to ask, are the tensions between US and China entirely negative to ASEAN? But could it be actually something more positive to us?
Okay, thank you. Is it entirely negative, or whether it offers opportunities to ASEAN? I think Ambassador Tan is the person to answer that. You, please.
Okay, hi, I am Nigel, a year 1 student at Tembusu College. So my question is more about if there are any other great powers that we can consider, because in the poster that's used as the background, there's also UK and France, but I'm also thinking more about Russia and India, whether they have been playing a part in ASEAN as well.
When I framed the question, great powers, I had in mind the United States, China, Russia, Japan, and India. Yeah. I would consider these 5 the major powers, you know. So whether I wasn't including the EU and France and UK, but once the UK exits the EU, the UK has already declared its intention to play an important proactive role in this region. Yeah. So what's your question?
My question was more about whether the other powers are playing a role in ASEAN as well.
Okay, the role of the other major power. Yeah. We have not talked about Japan and India and Russia. Maybe Simon, you can take care of that. Okay. 1 more question.
Hi, I'm Brian, and I study political science. My question is a bit ties in nicely Marissa's question, but I think I'd like to add more historical context to it. So, as I understand it, when ASEAN was formed in 1967, it was formed in the context, the backdrop of the Cold War, and the founding nations of ASEAN were sort of seen as being a Western camp of the Cold War. So, in today's time, where referencing Mike Pence's recent speech.
But it wasn't a very accurate perception, because of the 5 founding members. 2 were members of the American-inspired CITO, namely Thailand and Philippines, but the other 3 were not. So the 5 original members of ASEAN were not all aligned with the Americans. 3 of them belonged to the non-aligned camp. Yeah? Right. But we were viewed as a creature of the Cold War. Which is your point, right? Yeah, and so okay, so what's your question?
So I guess in today's, and if indeed, realist political thinkers did predict that what if one day China and US goes to war, where does this leave ASEAN? Will there come a day where ASEAN is forced to take sides? Okay. And what does this mean for ASEAN unity and
okay. Will the evil day ever come, Adrian, when you have to declare your allegiance? Are you with the Americans or the Chinese? Is there 1 more question?
Sorry, I just asked.
Oh, this is for more. Okay.
Sorry, the question I want to ask is how does ASEAN involve civil society and not just states.
Okay,
actors.
very good.
Yeah, thank you.
It's exactly for her field. So we got 4 very good questions. Who do you want to start first? Okay, Hang Seng, you go first.
The question is, US-China competition, is that negative or positive? I think the challenge for ASEAN really is how do we navigate, how do we respond to that competition. You would remember that PM said something very true about the China-American trade war. He said that when there is this Chinese-American trade war, it affects countries, small countries, open countries like Singapore. That is bad. But equally bad, if not worse, would be if China and the US become so pally that they get together and set the rules. That would be even worse for us. So I think the same apply to ASEAN. If the major powers set the rules and dictate the terms of engagement, that would be worse for us.
Simon?
I was assigned the question about the other great powers. In the context, I will try to actually answer also Marissa and Brian's question. I think we are all between. Every country, even the so-called major powers, are facing this turbulence from the US-China competition and the uncertainty about Trump, the characteristic uncertainty of just doing it his own way. So you see a lot of realignments happening everywhere. The EU is trying to engage with ASEAN more. So is South Korea. So is India with its Act East policy. So is Japan. Everyone's sort of pivoting to ASEAN. Mind you, they're also pivoting to each other. You see, I predict that the Japan-China relations will never be wonderful, but they will be warmer. They're warming up now compared to what they were 3 years ago. India-Japan relations are doing well. So I think a lot of times you see everyone scrambling around. To put it another way, as Ambassador Tan said, Prime Minister said, a more colorful way, when the elephants fight, the grass dies. Mind you, when the elephants make love, the grass also doesn't do so well. So when there's a lot of pressure on the small countries, what do? First, I think I mentioned how the power to be and. You must try to engage as many of these places as possible. That requires a certain nimbleness, all the C's that Ambassador Tan talked about earlier. The second thing I think was be careful about having too much influence from any one of these great powers. Our good friend Bilahari Kausikan has warned publicly about letting China influence us too much. And this is very true. Singapore is vulnerable in a way that Australia and New Zealand are not, because a lot of us trace a Chinese heritage. But the other thing is also true. The way we've been brought up, most of us, including me as an English-speaking Singaporean, is the glasses I wear are Anglo-American. We look at the world as today in a our ethos is very Anglo-American. And I think to really be the player of and to avoid influence on each side, we have to recognize this and try to strike that word balance, that word cooperative relationship with both. If we have to choose, well, the point is we may not have to choose, because I think...
And don't anticipate Adrian's question.
Oh, sorry.
Adrian,
sorry. I will leave that to Adrian.
So Adrian, you have to answer the question. Will the evil day ever come when you have to declare your allegiance?
Using the analogy of the elephants, I would say the best scenario for ASEAN is when the elephants are moving sideways without moving their feet, because you get a bit of shade, a bit of wind, but they are not stepping on us. I don't think we are going to see conflict very soon, because I think both countries, China and the United States, are not looking for a chance to fight, right? They are maneuvering and for positions. But if the day comes and they decide to go into a hot conflict in the South China Sea, mind you, South China Sea is not very far from Singapore, right? And these are serious lines of communication. Singapore is a major port. American warships will pass by, and Chinese warship will also ask to pass by. But my point here is, in the day where we have to choose, I think it's the day that ASEAN will break. So that day is a horrible scenario for, at least in my opinion. So But one concern I have, and this is a point that Prof. Ko has mentioned, is actually Indonesia. Indonesia is a big power in Southeast Asia. It's a G20 member. If pressure is building so much that ASEAN cannot function anymore, what is there for Indonesia to do? Indonesia can stand on its own. It's also important for us as ASEAN to keep Indonesia engaged. And that's my point.
Thank you, Adrian. Mo, you have the last word. The role of civil society.
Give a woman a mic and she never lets it go. And that probably can characterize how most of the governmental organizations view civil society. There's civil society and there's civil society, but you know, I can't help recalling the ASEAN People's Assembly, which I guess is the first iteration of ASEAN bringing the civil society groups together. I mean, Simon, I have to defer to you. It's the ASEAN network of the think tanks, the Track 2 as we call it, the ASEAN Institutes of Strategic and International Studies, that initiated the ASEAN People's Assembly at the turn of the century, where I think voices from the ground on issues that mattered for communities in each of the ASEAN member states were becoming more and more important. So again, maybe because I've monitored ASEAN cooperation from the point of view of social and human development, I see much more leeway and potential for engaging the civil society, involving the civil society in most of the policy issues in these areas. And I think one of the earliest successes that ASEAN had was in the issue of HIV and AIDS. So from a condition where I think the heads of state and government probably did not want to talk about it, did not want to acknowledge that we had HIV and AIDS issues collectively in the region. Imagine at the 7th ASEAN Summit, which was hosted and chaired by Brunei, issued a leaders' declaration on ASEAN's priorities to tackle HIV and AIDS. And this is because through the ASEAN Task Force on AIDS, the different regional civil society groups dealing with AIDS issues had managed to prevail upon government officials that was fed up through the policy channel and later on became something that now ASEAN has adopted region-wide. So I think that's how ASEAN can engage civil society. I think on the political issues, on issues that deal with what every sovereign government feels is going to impinge on how it goes about its own governance, there will always be difficulties and challenges. But I think the challenge that we set ourselves is where do we identify the issues that are going to affect communities the most? And how then do we interact with our governments through the channels available to bring this up regionally as a collective action? And that's how it goes in terms of social collective action. It is to fill a gap where usual governance mechanisms can't fill.
Thank you, May. Thank you, Mo. My wife has asked me to close the forum by 9 o'clock sharp, so I'm 5 minutes over time. So I'll be brief. I'll just conclude by first quoting Hang Seng and saying, ASEAN will not break up. ASEAN will not break up because every one of the 10 member states is invested in ASEAN. Everyone will be worse off without ASEAN than with ASEAN. So I think the answer to my question is, will ASEAN break up? The answer is probably no. The second question is more complicated. I see tension not only between US and China, I see tension between China and Japan, China and India. I'm beginning to see a certain realignment of forces among the great powers. The United States is co-opting Japan, Australia, and India into a new coalition. And I think the so-called free and open Indo-Pacific very much inspired by the Quad, the four democracies. On the other side, I'm beginning to see a closer and closer alliance between China and Russia. So for ASEAN, we don't want to see the region divided between a group led by the United States and a rival group led by China. It's not good for us. We don't want to see a return to the Cold War. As for the really big question, will there be a war between the United States and China? A few years ago, all of us confidently said no, it's impossible. If you ask me today, I'm less certain. Yeah, I'm less certain. And I asked the students to please read a book written by a good friend of mine, Professor Graham Allison of Harvard University, who wrote a book called Destined for War. Will the United States and China escape the two cities trap? It is a good book. It is a good book, and I've read it a few times, and I'm reading it again. Because the appendix of the book is very interesting. The appendix of the book contains the research done by Professor Allison and his student. They've gone back 500 years. They have documented that in the last 500 years, there have been 16 cases where an incumbent hegemon was faced with a rising challenger. And they said in 11 of the 16 cases, war was a result. There were only 4 cases when the transition of power took place peacefully, you know? So, I mean, history need not imprison us about the future. I think whether or not there will be a war between US and China really depends on the leaders in Washington and Beijing. But you can no longer rule it out as impossible. Yeah, that's all I'm willing to say. I think if I could quote the famous saying by this Greek historian Thucydides in his masterpiece on the Peloponnesian War. And what he said is this: the rise of Athens created fear in Sparta, and this made war inevitable. So the question I ask myself is, has the rise of China created fear in America? And if it has, will this make war inevitable, as was the case in ancient Greece between Athens and Sparta? I don't know the answer, but this is the question I want to leave with you this evening. Thank you all very much.